used to say, that they said as little boys. It's a parody on some prayers, and it originated from the fact that when they were home on the farm, they had mainly potatoes for a diet, occasionally some meat, occasionally some bread and some other things, but they were primarily potato farmers. As a matter of fact, all my people are either potato farmers or clergymen, and I think they all went to college on the Applejack Still, which was out in the old house. They sold that. They'd cook up a batch and take it out and sell it down in Allentown, and that's where that was the money crop, really. But subsistence was potatoes, and so they made up a prayer. Now, the vernacular, the Pennsylvania German, the Kartoffel, which is a German name for potato, is called Grumbeere, which is groundberry, which is really not correct, but this is still used in the vernacular. It's a Grumbeere, so the prayer went something like this: Mariets Grumbeere in alle frie, middags Grumbeere mit saure brie, ovets Grumbeere mit samte Kleid, bis in alle Ewigkeit. Amen. Literally, a translation of this means potatoes in the morning, very early, for breakfast, potatoes at noon with sour dressing, potatoes in the evening, fully clothed, which probably meant baked potatoes, or potatoes in a jacket, or whatever you want to call it. And the last line is, for all eternity, forever and ever. Amen. I'd like to say a little bit about powwow doctors. There is a period in our history in this country when there was an extreme shortage of doctors, and all of the ones that were here were European trained, because people were in this country in the 16th century, 1520, I think the Pilgrims arrived, or something. It was 1620. And until 1770 somewhere, just after the Revolution, there was a medical school founded in this country, so that doctors that there were European trained, and there were very few of those. And in between there, a lot of things rose up to fill the hiatus for medical care. There are always people in any society who will administer to other people for their ills and ailments. One of these things that arose was powwow doctoring. Now, powwow doctoring had some kind of a religious background. No one knows really where, or how, or when, but they usually quote scriptures, and some of them are still practicing now. They get around the practicing without a license rule by just offering their services, and presumably for free. And if the patient is satisfied, they're permitted to drop a contribution in a box at the door. There is one such operator still going in a local area in Trumbarsville. Nobody knows exactly where he is, but the patients seem to find him or her. Now, powwow doctoring, first of all, is a word of mouth. There are no textbooks, no dictionaries, no nothing, and it's all in the vernacular, in the Pennsylvania German language. They have various cures for various things. So one of the most fascinating names for me is what they call Algavox. Nobody really knows what Algavox is, but they used to have an English translation for this, calling it liver groan. This was some kind of a pain along the lower rib area, and usually happened in small children, sometimes in adults, and followed a long dragging along carriage ride, or ride with a horse and wagon. People got distress, and this was sometimes called Algavox, liver groan. Verbal training was passed down from, usually it had to be, it was not effective unless it was transmitted from a man to a woman, or from a woman to a man. A father could not give it to his son, a mother to her daughter, a mother to a son, and a son to a daughter. But it had to go from one sex to the other for some reason or other. And no one knows why this is either. But the lady who taught me was old Katie Bittenbender in Red Hill. Her daughter is now the community nurse here. But she could never teach her daughter about it, but she would teach me. And so, yes, she did. She taught me a number of things. Remember the procedure for Ogawaks, or liver grown, so-called. I've forgotten that, but I do know one that my grandmother, who would never teach me the art, but she practiced it, and I loused it up one night because my sister had, my younger sister, in her teens. She was just in her pubertal age, was developing a thyroid, large thyroid, which frequently happens in pubertal girls. And these things go away spontaneously, so you see the powwow doctors had nothing to lose. However, this thing was getting larger. My mother became alarmed, and so she told her mother, Mary Brownmiller, that she should do something about it. So they had to go out in the backyard under the pear tree with a new moon, and then she would lay her hand on this thyroid, the neck of the little girl, and say, was ik say nem tu, was ik raap nem dap, and then walk around the pear tree, and then say again, was ik say nem tu, was ik raap nem dap. She did this for a total of 3 times, and frequent administrations of this over a period of time would supposedly cure the enlarged thyroid. However, the thing recovered spontaneously. Now, translated, that means she was standing there looking at the moon, which was new. It was just growing into a full moon eventually. And she would say, what I see is growing, what I rub is shrinking. And this was the translation, was ik zie nem tu, was ik raap nem dap. And I don't know what the significance was of the pear tree. Maybe there was a partridge in there. I don't know. Should not be confused with hexarai. This is something else. Hexarai is evil. Powwowing is good. Powwowing is to help people, to cure people. Hexarai is more or less of some type of colloquial voodoo where people put the finger on somebody and do evil things to them. There was a lady I knew, an old lady who was quite senile, but still could remember things from way back, who insisted that her neighbor across the street was putting a hex on her because she would get vague pains and aches and all kinds of things that many times old people can't understand. And she insisted that this fellow was putting the hex on her, and nothing would get better with her until he was either moved out of the area or something happened to him. And she was wishing all kinds of evil things on him, so I don't know who was hexing who. This is probably the origin of the notorious hex signs that everyone knows exist in our area here. This was supposed to protect against this sort of thing. This lady would look out to the window and see a piece of paper, scrap, maybe a plastic bag or something, blowing across the street, and she insisted that this was an evil spirit coming her way as a result of this hex arriving, this fellow across the street. We, some time back, had a very famous murder case in Philadelphia which was never solved in Fairmount Park. There was a fellow down there, a local boy, had gone to the city and he was doing quite well. But one night he was found in Fairmount Park. His body was found in Fairmount Park with 12 stab wounds right around his heart. And this was done by someone who just disliked him or had a grudge against him, or someone he may have done wrong to. But this was attributed by the newspapers to some hex because they knew this fella had come from our area here, and they insisted because it was unsolved, they had to cover up the police somehow, so they told them it was a hex murder. Well, people never used any herbs or medicine or anything. This was entirely with the hands or with the voice and nothing else. It was, I presume, a form of psychotherapy. I don't know what else you might call it. Of course, we have chiropractors and naturopaths and various cults and food freaks and things like this, which are, it's not any more absurd than some of the things that go on today. This is something else again about the Christmas time. All I remember about that was when we were children. Now this is approximately 60 years ago. We lived in a town. We had no fireplace in our house for the St. Nicholas to come down, but he was called the Bell's Nickel. I don't know why that name. I don't know where that name originated, but we would wait for the Bell's Nickel, and instead of having a chimney, we left the window open, no matter how cold it was, and left one of the windows in the front room just open an inch or two so he could open it and come in. And the next morning, there were the gifts on the floor, and the window was closed. So obviously, Bell's Nickel had been there the night before at some time. This is another phase of tradition that hasn't been practiced recently, but if there were a new boy, this was predominantly a rural society, and if there were a new boy moved into the area, or a young fellow that wanted to be with the boys in the process of growing up, they would take him Elfridrich hunting, which is similar to snipe hunting. This is not entirely local, but the name is local. Elfridrich is a local name. I don't even know how it's spelled, and everybody pronounces it differently, but this consisted of the new boy being told, now tonight after dark, you bring a burlap bag, and we'll go snipe hunting, Elfridrich. They would go out, they'd find a hole, probably a woodchuck, groundhog, or Grundsau, which is a groundhog, a Grundsau. And they would go out and they'd say, now you stay here with your bag and hold it in front of the hole, and we'll go over the hill and chase the Grundsau, or the Elfridrich, out. So they would promptly take off and go home. And the poor boy would sit there all night with his bag. And depending on what hour of the day he got wise, or if he fell asleep, or maybe by morning he'd think, well, he'd been had, which indeed is what he had. Known as Elfridrich hunting. One of the traditions that is fairly common is a bull band. They used to call it a Calathumpian band. I don't know why, but this consisted of, there were a newly married couple in the neighborhood. All the neighborhood would get together at someone's house and get some old tin cans or saucepans and sticks. And as soon as this young couple had gone to bed, they would come to the house and beat on these kettles and cans, and just an incessant noise until they opened the house and left them in and offered them a treat. Then everyone would go home, but sometimes these treats lasted pretty well into the night. I know of one that went all night. Talked about hex signs, which were signs to ward off evil spirits. And there was a sign that was supposed to just be good for anybody, and that was called a distal fink, which many people hear about, don't know exactly what it is. Well, the distal fink is a thistle finch, which is actually a bluebird. And whenever a sign is up anywhere, one of these circular signs, if it has sometimes a heart on it and then a bluebird, this is truly a distal fink. Any other sign is a hex sign. As I was walking down the street, a billboard met my eye. The advertising section would make you laugh and cry. The wind and rain the night before washed half that board away. The other half remaining would make that billboard say, come smoke a Coca-Cola, tomato ketchup cigarettes. See Lillian Russell wrestle with a box of oyster reds. Heinz's pork and beans will meet again in a finished fight. And Silent Joe will speak about Sapolio tonight. BVD's the best hotel. Let Colgate's do your work. Ask the man who owns one, take home an arrow shirt. Have you a little fairy in your home eventually? Why not now? Postum beautifies the hair and boy's life tells you how. Peruna for the horses, it is the best in town. Castoria cures the measles, you pay $10 down. Teeth extracted without paying for the price of half a dime. There'll be a sale of old clothes, a little lot of time. Tradition, not unique to our culture, that is known as the Grundsau, the groundhog prediction, weather prediction. Groundhog Day, Grundsau Day, is on the 2nd of February every year. If it is a clear day and the Grundsau comes out of his burrow and sees his shadow, tradition has it that he goes back in for 6 more weeks because he knows there will be 6 more weeks of winter weather. Now, there's an organization made up of people in this area called the Grundsau Lodge. There are now about 20 chapters. I belong to number 13, which is the Grundsau Lodge on the Barioma, which is the Groundhog Lodge of the Perkiomenville Creek. They have it all, it's all a valley. There are various others, the Dohegan, the Dohek, the Lechal, which is Lehigh, and they're all named for valleys of the stream in their area. The meeting is conducted in the vernacular, in the Pennsylvania German, from the asking of the grace to the benediction, all the speeches, and anyone who is at loss for a word in the vernacular, or perhaps accidentally comes out with a word in another language, usually English, has to pay a fine, which his conscience is usually his guide. And this is the tip for the waitresses. So sometimes the waitresses attempt to trick you into using an English word. Sometimes they ask something that can't be expressed in the vernacular. Now, most of these lodges meet on the 2nd. Some of them actually go out and look at the groundhog hole and presumably see him come out and see his shadow and go back in again, or come out and stay out if the day is a dreary day. Most of them meet on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, somewhere around the 2nd of February. Ours meets the 3rd Thursday in April. So we're not interested in his prediction, we're interested in how well he does. So our meeting will be coming up shortly. Ron Koud had geglichet bij de Buwitse Saai. Da ist alle over naasgegangen, haben sie als Paar getrunken und geschwätzt. Und als immer spät heimgekommen. Die Männer hat daheim geguckt, hat die Kinder gehielt, hat alles versagt. Und die hat es nicht all gut geglichen, aber sie hat es nichts tun können dabei. So, over das der Amandus heimgekommen. Und alle over hat er auch gewähnt gehabt, wann der schon gehen ins Bett, aber noch im Bett gegangen ist. Und dann over ist er heimgekommen. Und was er getrunken hat, hat nicht recht geschmeckt. Er hat das Licht da gemacht und gesagt, ei, ich hab die Wäschbläuen gesoffen. Mende, kommt aber geschwind, ich hab die Wäschbläuen gesoffen, ich bin am Verrecken. Na, die Mende aber dann gerufen, ja, weil das habe ich da schon lang gekonnt. Na, kannst du unheim bloß scheiße. Es war mal ein Junge, der hat immer neue Maschinen gehabt, alle Jahre. Een Rumbelsitz drin gehabt. Hat immer die Buben rausnehmen vor, alle Sonntagnachmittag sind sie auf und aufgefahren auf die Mainstraße. Einmal hat der Jimmy reingezogen, er hat einen rausbacken wollen, zurück ik bij gewollen in die main Straße, da hat zum Stehen gesagt, in der Straße sitzt, hat gesagt, hey, kommt etwas? Und das bin ich gesagt, ja, ich denke nicht. Dann hat er direkt Flatschutz gemacht. Er hat gesagt, hab gemeint, es kommt nichts. Und das bin ich gesagt, ja, weil ich habe nicht so gedacht. I think you should ask your mother about Gedächtnistag, when it is, and the tradition. She can tell you that, which is purely colloquial. This is a local Thanksgiving Day. It's on a different time, a different day, and a different tradition.